Sometimes, an old letter is more than just a piece of paper. Sometimes, it carries an entire lifetime of memories, a lifetime of waiting, and the final trace of a story that was never finished. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Emily Harper stood alone in the living room of her grandmother's old house. The house looked exactly as she remembered it from childhood. The same wooden floors, the same furniture, the same clock hanging on the wall. But one thing was missing: her grandmother. Just a few months earlier, Margaret Collins had passed away, leaving behind a quiet home filled with memories. Now, the family had decided it was time to sell the property. Emily had volunteered to clean the house before it went on the market. She expected it to be an ordinary day. A few boxes, a little dust, nothing more. She had no idea she was about to uncover a secret that had been hidden for nearly 50 years. Slowly, she climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The air felt still. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight that slipped through a small crack in the roof. The attic was packed with old boxes and forgotten belongings. Christmas decorations, family photographs, books nobody had touched in years. Emily began sorting through everything one box at a time. Hours passed. Then suddenly, something caught her eye. In the far corner of the attic sat a small wooden chest. It looked different from everything else, almost as if someone had intentionally hidden it away. Curious, Emily walked over and picked it up. A thick layer of dust covered the lid. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Carefully, she lifted the top. Inside were several black and white photographs, a few old coins, and a yellowed envelope. Immediately, her attention fixed on the envelope. She gently picked it up. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were 4 words: "For Margaret Collins." Emily froze. Margaret Collins was her grandmother. Then she noticed the date: May 14th, 1976. Her heart skipped a beat. The letter was nearly 50 years old. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then quietly whispered, "How did this end up here?" Questions flooded her mind. If the letter had been written to her grandmother, why had she never received it? And if she hadn't, how had it remained hidden for all these years? After a brief hesitation, Emily carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter. The paper had become fragile with age. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. "Dear Margaret, by the time you read this, I may already be across the ocean. I don't know what fate has planned for me. But there is one thing I know for certain. You are the most beautiful part of my life. If I return, we'll buy that little house with the white fence we've always talked about. And if I don't, know that my final thought was of you." Emily lowered the letter. The room suddenly felt silent. This wasn't just a letter. It was someone's heart, preserved in ink. Someone who may never have come home. Then her eyes moved to the final sentence, and a chill ran down her spine. If this letter never reaches you, perhaps fate intends for someone else to finish our story. Emily read the line again, then once more. It felt strangely personal, as if the past itself was reaching out to her. Quickly, she turned the envelope over. There, written in faded ink, was the sender's name: Thomas Reed. The name meant nothing to her. But now she needed answers. Who was Thomas Reed? And what role had he played in her grandmother's life? That night, Emily sat in front of her laptop and began searching. Hours passed. At first, she found nothing. Then finally, An old military record appeared on her screen. Thomas Reed, age 24. Deployed in 1976. Several months later, missing in action. Emily stared at the screen. Missing. Not confirmed dead. Missing. The mystery had suddenly become much deeper. And Emily had no idea. This was only the beginning. Because over the next few days, she would uncover a hidden chapter of her grandmother's life. A chapter nobody in the family had ever known existed. Sometimes, the answers we search for are hidden in places we never think to look. And sometimes, the people we love leave behind secrets that remain buried for decades. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Thomas Reed. The name echoed in her mind long after she had left her grandmother's house. Who was he? Why had her grandmother never spoken about him? And if they had truly loved each other, why had she spent her entire life alone? The questions refused to leave her. The next morning, Emily returned to the old house. But this time, she wasn't there to clean. She was there to find answers. The house felt different now, as if every room was hiding a piece of a story she had never known. She walked upstairs and entered her grandmother's bedroom. Everything looked exactly as Margaret had left it. The neatly arranged clothes, the old perfume bottle sitting on the dresser, the framed photographs beside the bed. For a moment, Emily simply stood there remembering. Then she began searching. One drawer after another. The first contained old receipts. The second held family photographs. The third contained birthday cards and letters. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained Thomas Reed. Then, in the bottom drawer of a small bedside table, she found something unexpected. A worn leather diary. Its cover was faded with age. There was no name written on it. No label. Nothing. Emily carefully picked it up. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Slowly, she opened the first page. Most of the early entries were ordinary. Daily thoughts. Small memories. Simple moments from life. But then, one date immediately caught her attention. June 3rd, 1975. Emily began to read. Today, Thomas asked me to marry him. I didn't say yes right away. But the truth is, I've been waiting for that moment for years. Emily froze. This was the first time she had ever seen Thomas's name written by her grandmother herself. Suddenly, everything felt more real. She turned the page. Today we walked along the river. Thomas spent the entire afternoon talking about the future. He keeps dreaming about a small house with a white fence. A place we can call our own. Emily lowered the diary. A chill ran through her. The white fence. The exact same dream Thomas had mentioned in the letter. For the first time, she could see their lives coming together. The letter wasn't just words. It was part of a real love story. A story that had once been filled with hope. She continued reading. Page after page. Entry after entry. A picture slowly began to form. Thomas and Margaret had known each other since childhood. They had grown up together. They had shared the same schools, the same friends, and eventually, the same dreams. Over time, friendship had become love. And love had become a promise. A promise to spend their lives together. Then everything changed. Thomas received military orders. He had to leave. One of the entries read, "He promised me he would come back. And I believe him. I always will." Emily took a slow breath. She already knew what Margaret didn't know then. Thomas never returned. But as she continued reading, the diary became more emotional. The handwriting grew shakier. The entries became shorter. And the hope slowly began to fade. Then she reached an entry dated November 18th, 1976. Emily's eyes moved across the page. 2 military officers came to my door today. They told me Thomas is missing. They said he may never come home. Emily stopped. Even after all these years, she could almost feel her grandmother's pain. The ink was smudged in places, as though tears had fallen onto the page while it was being written. She continued reading. I refuse to believe them. Until I know the truth, I will keep waiting. Emily turned the page. Then another. And another. Month after month. Year after year. The same message appeared again and again. No news today. I'm still waiting. Maybe next week. Maybe next month. The words became heartbreaking. It wasn't just grief. It was hope refusing to die. A hope that survived for years. Then decades. For the first time in her life, Emily understood something that had always puzzled her family. Why Margaret never married. Why she spent her life alone. Why she never spoke about romance. It wasn't because she didn't want love. It was because she had already found it. And she never stopped waiting for it to come back. Tears filled Emily's eyes. She kept reading. Then she reached an entry that completely broke her heart. August 12th, 1988. 12 years after Thomas disappeared. The entry read, Today I turned 40. People still ask why I never married. I always smile and change the subject. Because how could I explain that my heart still belongs to someone who may not even be alive anymore? Emily slowly closed the diary. Silence filled the room. For years, she had believed her grandmother lived a quiet and ordinary life. But now she knew the truth. Margaret Collins had spent decades carrying a love story that never had an ending. A story nobody else knew. A story she carried completely alone. Emily wiped away a tear and looked down at the diary resting in her hands. But something told her the mystery wasn't over yet. Not even close. Because hidden within the final pages of that diary was a secret that would change everything she thought. Sometimes the smallest discoveries lead to the biggest questions. And sometimes a single photograph can change everything you thought you knew. Emily slowly closed the diary. The room was silent. The only sound was the steady ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall. Her eyes were filled with tears. For the first time, she truly understood her grandmother's life. Margaret Collins had spent decades waiting. Waiting for a man who never came home. Waiting for answers that never arrived. Waiting for a future that was never given a chance to exist. Emily sat quietly, staring at the diary resting in her lap. It was heartbreaking. Yet something deep inside her told her the story wasn't over. Not yet. As she prepared to place the diary back into the drawer, something slipped from between the pages. A small object fluttered to the floor. Emily looked down. It was a photograph. Carefully, she picked it up. The edges were worn and faded with age. As she turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. The photograph showed a young man and a young woman standing side by side. Both were smiling. The woman was unmistakably Margaret. Young. Happy. Full of hope. And beside her stood a man Emily had never seen before. But she already knew exactly who he was. Thomas Reed. For the first time, she was looking at the face behind the letters. The face behind the mystery. The face her grandmother had waited for all those years. Thomas looked confident. Kind. The sort of person who made others feel safe simply by being there. Emily stared at the photograph for several moments. It felt strange. After everything she had learnt, Thomas no longer felt like a name on paper. He felt real. Like a person whose life had somehow become connected to her own. Then she noticed something written on the back. In faded handwriting were a few simple words. Summer of 1975. The year we planned our future. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. A future. A home. A marriage. A life together. Everything they had dreamed about. Everything they had lost. She was about to place the photograph aside when something else caught her attention. A small piece of paper was tucked behind it. Almost hidden. As though someone had intentionally left it there. Carefully, Emily pulled it free. The paper was old and partially torn. There wasn't much written on it. Just a name. And an address. Samuel Reed. Emily's heart immediately began to race. Reed. The same last name as Thomas. Could Samuel be a relative? A brother? A father? Someone who knew what really happened. For the first time since finding the letter, Emily felt as though she had discovered a real lead. A real connection to the past. That evening, she returned home and opened her laptop. She began searching. Hours passed. Search result after search result. Most led nowhere. But finally, she found something. An old phone number connected to the Reed family. Emily stared at the number on her screen. Her finger hovered above the call button. Part of her was nervous. What if nobody answered? What if the number no longer worked? Or worse, what if the answers she was searching for didn't exist? For several seconds, she hesitated. Then she took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone began to ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each ring felt longer than the last. Then suddenly, someone answered. Hello? The voice was old. Weak. Yet clear enough to understand. For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. She hadn't expected to get this far. Finally, she gathered the courage to respond. My name is Emily Harper. There was a brief silence. Then she continued. I was wondering if you knew someone named Samuel Reed. The line immediately went quiet. So quiet that Emily thought the call had disconnected. Several seconds passed. Then the elderly voice finally spoke. Samuel Reed was my father. Emily sat upright. Her pulse quickened. This was it. The first real connection. The first person who might know the truth. Carefully, she asked another question. And, did you know Thomas Reed? This time the silence lasted even longer. Then the voice returned. Softer than before. Thomas was my uncle. Emily's heart nearly stopped. For 50 years, Thomas Reed had been a mystery. A missing soldier. A forgotten name. And now she was speaking to someone who had actually known him. Neither of them spoke for a few moments. Then Emily finally asked the question that had been haunting her since she found the letter. Did Thomas really die? On the other end of the line, she heard a long, slow breath. As if the man was choosing his words very carefully. Then he spoke. One simple word. No. Emily froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. What do you mean? She asked. The old man paused. Then he said something that changed everything. I don't believe Thomas ever died. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Nothing made sense anymore. For decades, everyone had believed Thomas Reed was gone. The military records, the missing reports, the years of silence. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Yet this man was telling her something completely different. Something impossible. Emily struggled to find the words. If he didn't die, what happened to him? The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he answered. If you truly want the truth, you'll have to come here. Not over the phone. Emily looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in shades of gold and orange. But her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. For the first time since discovering the letter, there was hope. Hope that Thomas's story wasn't over. Hope that answers still existed. And hope that somewhere beyond 50 years of mystery, the truth was finally waiting to be found. What Emily didn't know was that her journey was about to uncover a secret far bigger than she ever imagined. A secret that had remained hidden for half a century. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits. Hidden beneath years of silence. Waiting for someone willing to uncover it. That night, Emily barely slept. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the phone conversation over and over again. One sentence refused to leave her mind. I don't believe Thomas ever died. The words echoed through her thoughts. For nearly 50 years, everyone had believed the same story. Thomas Reed had disappeared. Thomas Reed never came home. Thomas Reed was gone. But what if that story was wrong? What if the truth was something entirely different? The next morning, Emily packed a small bag and prepared for the journey. She was going to meet the man who claimed to know what really happened. The drive took several hours. As the miles passed beneath her tires, her mind filled with questions. If Thomas survived, why didn't he return? Why didn't he contact Margaret? Why would someone stay silent for half a century? The further she drove, the more impossible the mystery seemed. By late afternoon, she arrived in a quiet rural town. The kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly. Small houses lined the streets. Old trees swayed gently in the wind. Everything felt peaceful, almost untouched by the modern world. Following the address she had written down, Emily eventually turned onto a narrow road and stopped in front of a modest white house. For a moment, she sat inside the car. Her heart was racing. This was it. The closest she had ever been to the truth. As she stepped outside, she noticed an elderly man standing on the front porch. It was almost as if he had been expecting her. He offered a gentle smile. Emily? She nodded. Yes. The man extended his hand. My name is David Reed. Emily shook his hand. The two walked inside. The house felt warm and welcoming. Family photographs covered the walls. Books filled the shelves. For a few minutes, they exchanged polite conversation. But both of them knew why she had come. Eventually, David's expression became serious. The room grew quiet. And after a long pause, he finally began. Thomas was my uncle. Emily listened carefully. David looked down at his hands before continuing. and I may be one of the few people left who knows what really happened to him." Emily's pulse quickened. For years, Thomas had been nothing more than a mystery. A missing soldier. A forgotten name. Now she was finally hearing the story from someone who had known him personally. David leaned back in his chair. His eyes drifted toward the window, as if he were looking into the past. In 1976, when Thomas disappeared, the military told our family they had lost contact with him. They couldn't find him. There were no answers. Just uncertainty. Months passed. Then years. Eventually, everyone accepted the same painful conclusion. Thomas was gone. At least, that's what they believed. David paused. Then he said something that made Emily sit up straight. But 7 years later, something happened. Emily's heart skipped a beat. David stood and walked toward a cabinet in the corner of the room. Carefully, he removed a small wooden box. The wood was worn with age, as if it had been opened countless times over the years. He placed it gently on the table. Then he opened it. Inside were old photographs, documents, letters, pieces of a life preserved in silence. After a moment, David removed a faded envelope. The date written on the front immediately caught Emily's attention. 1983. Emily stared at it. Her heart began to pound. David placed the envelope in front of her. This arrived 7 years after Thomas disappeared. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. A letter. From Thomas. 7 years later. That could only mean one thing. He had survived. "May I see it?" she asked quietly. David nodded. Carefully, Emily unfolded the fragile paper inside. The handwriting was shaky but readable. David began reading aloud. "If this letter reaches you, know that I am alive." Emily froze. Alive. The words seemed impossible. David continued. "But I cannot come home. I don't know who I am anymore. I only know that my name is Thomas." The room fell silent. Emily felt her chest tighten. The words were heartbreaking. David kept reading. "My memory is damaged. Most of my past is gone. I remember pieces. Faces. Voices. But nothing stays long enough for me to understand." Emily slowly lowered her eyes. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. Thomas hadn't abandoned Margaret. He hadn't forgotten her by choice. Something terrible had happened to him. Something that had stolen the life he once knew. David folded the letter carefully. The doctors believed he suffered a severe head injury. They said the damage affected his memory. Emily looked at him. Did he ever remember Margaret? For a moment, David didn't answer. Then he nodded slowly. Not at first. Emily held her breath. But over time, David continued, pieces started coming back. The room seemed smaller now. Every answer only created more questions. Emily's voice trembled slightly. If he remembered, why didn't he go back? David turned toward the window. For several seconds, he simply stared outside. Then he spoke. And what he said broke Emily's heart. Because by the time he remembered everything, it was already too late. Emily felt a chill run through her body. Too late? What did that mean? What had happened? David remained silent, as if the memory still hurt after all these years. Then slowly, he stood up. Without saying a word, he walked toward an old cabinet near the wall. He opened the door and reached inside. A moment later, he returned carrying another box. This one looked even older than the first. Carefully, he placed it on the table between them. Emily stared at it. Something about the box felt important, almost sacred. David rested his hand on top of it. Then he looked directly at her. "Emily." His voice was softer now. "Everything Thomas treasured for the rest of his life is inside this box." Emily's heart began to race. She could feel the truth getting closer. Closer than it had ever been before. David looked down at the box, then back at her. "And what you're about to see will finally explain everything." Emily swallowed hard. Because deep down, she knew the answers hidden inside that box would change this story forever. And the truth, waiting inside, was far more emotional than she could ever imagine. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are not the ones that stay together. Sometimes, they are the ones that never stop waiting. Emily sat quietly at the table. Her eyes remained fixed on the old wooden box resting between her and David. For days, she had followed clues scattered across half a century. A forgotten letter, a hidden diary, a faded photograph. And now, she was finally standing at the edge of the truth. David looked down at the box and slowly lifted the lid. The room fell silent. Emily held her breath. Inside were dozens of envelopes, neatly stacked, carefully preserved. Every single one carried the same name: Margaret Collins. Emily stared in disbelief. "What are these?" she whispered. David looked at the letters for a moment before answering. "These are the letters Thomas wrote." He paused. "The letters he never sent." Emily felt her heart sink. Carefully, she picked up one of the envelopes. The date on it read 1985. She picked up another. 1987. Then another. 1991. Year after year. Letter after letter. Thomas had continued writing, even though Margaret never received a single one. David leaned back in his chair. When Thomas's memory started returning, Margaret returned with it. At first, it was only a name, then a face, and eventually, an entire lifetime of memories. Emily's eyes filled with tears. If he remembered her, why didn't he go back? David took a slow breath. The answer clearly wasn't easy, because he believed she had moved on. He thought she had married. He thought she had built a new life. He didn't want to reopen old wounds. The words hung heavily in the air. Thomas had spent years believing he was doing the right thing, while Margaret spent those same years waiting, alone. Emily carefully opened one of the letters. The paper crackled softly. Inside was Thomas's handwriting. She began to read. "Dear Margaret, if you ever read this letter, know that I never forgot you. I tried. But some loves never leave us. No matter how much time passes. I'm sorry. I came back too late." Emily lowered the page. Her hands trembled. The sadness inside those words felt almost unbearable. She opened another letter. This one was written several years later. "Today, I saw a house. It had a white fence. And suddenly, I remembered you. I remembered our dream. The dream that may now belong only to the past." Emily slowly looked up. The white fence. The same dream Thomas had written about nearly 50 years earlier. The same dream Margaret had written about in her diary. The dream they had built together. David nodded. He never forgot the house. Emily swallowed hard. What happened? A faint smile appeared on David's face. He bought one. For a moment, Emily thought she had misheard. A house with a white fence? David nodded again. Exactly like the one they used to talk about. Tears filled Emily's eyes. Even after all those years, Thomas had carried that dream with him. Not because he expected it to come true, but because it reminded him of her. David stood and walked toward the window. Then he pointed outside. The house is still there. Emily slowly walked over. And when she looked through the glass, her breath caught in her throat. There it was. A small house. A white fence surrounding the yard. Flowers blooming near the porch. Simple. Peaceful. Beautiful. The home they had imagined together. The home they never shared. Emily felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Thomas had kept his promise. Just not in the way either of them had imagined. A few moments later, David returned carrying a photograph. It was newer than the others. Much newer. He handed it to Emily. The picture showed an elderly man standing in front of the white fence house. His hair was completely grey. His face was lined with age. But his eyes carried something unmistakable. Loneliness. Emily immediately recognized him. Thomas Reed. This photograph had been taken during the final year of his life. Quietly, she asked, "Did he ever marry?" David answered without hesitation, "No." The room fell silent. Emily lowered her eyes. Margaret never married. Thomas never married. For decades, they had lived separate lives. Yet neither of them had given their heart to anyone else. Somehow, despite time, distance, and silence, their love had survived. David reached into the box one final time. Then he removed the last envelope. The final letter Thomas had ever written. The date showed it had been written only months before his death. Carefully, Emily opened it. The handwriting was shakier now. The writing of an old man nearing the end of his journey. She began to read. "Dear Margaret, if fate could give me one more chance to reach you, there is only one thing I would want to say. I never forgot my promise. I was late. Far too late. But someday, I hope our story will continue somewhere time can never separate us again. Forever yours, Thomas." Emily couldn't continue. Tears blurred the words on the page. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The old clock on the wall ticked quietly in the background. Finally, David broke the silence. "I think these letters should have reached her." A few days later, Emily returned home. She brought every letter with her. Each one carefully protected. Each one carrying a piece of a love story that had survived half a century.